Jesus and the Torah next on One Gospel. We continue with the Sermon on the Mount, where he first appointed his 12 apostles, he healed, and then he gives an extended sermon. We are in the part of it that is recorded in Matthew 5:21 through 22. Now, the immediate context is that he had just said, unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the Torah teachers and Pharisees, by no means will you enter into the kingdom of the heavens. So now we're going to find out what that looks like as he talks about specific parts of the Torah. Questions to consider as we look at this next section. Are religious teachers telling you things that aren't true? How big of a deal is anger anyway? What does it mean to be judged? And what is this mysterious place called Gehenna, which is generally translated as hell? You have heard that it was said to the ancients, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be subject to the judgment. But I say to you, that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause will be in danger of the judgment. Whoever will say to his brother, empty head, will be subject to the Sanhedrin. And whoever will say, you fool, will be subject to the fire of Gehenna. So before we start looking into this, if down in the bottom I have footnotes, and you see where it says, whoever is angry with his brother without a cause, that clause is not actually in 3 of the oldest manuscripts of Matthew. In general, One Gospel chooses to use the majority text, but we acknowledge the differences when they exist. And this is one of those differences that does change the meaning. Instead of, in some versions of Matthew, it just says, whoever is angry with his brother, period, will be in danger of the judgment. So we're going to start off by looking at what he said. You've heard that it was said to the ancients. Now I'm going to fly through these first parts, and then I'm just going to get to the meat of this story, which is, what is Gehenna? What is hell? This is the first time Jesus mentions hell in any of his teachings up to this point. So it's worth diving into it. But he first says, you've heard that it was said to the ancients. And there's 2 things. The first one was, thou shalt not kill. Well, that was in the Bible. Thou shalt not kill is found in 2 places in Torah, in both Exodus and Deuteronomy. But the quote, whoever murders will be subject to the judgment, that's not actually in the Bible. So that probably means that he was referring to the oral law, which was developed by this time, at least on some level, because he refers to it. He calls it the traditions of the elders. But basically the people of his time they were told by the people who taught Torah, well, this is what you need to do. But they didn't necessarily separate those things. There was what was written, and then there was what was their tradition. And the next part, whoever is angry with his brother without a cause will be in danger of the judgment. We're going to probably go back to this later after we talked about hell, because the whole point of this section is about anger. because this next part is basically just an insult. So he says, hey, you're going to be judged if you're angry without a cause. He then says, if you just insult your brother by calling him airhead, you'll be subject to a higher court, because the judgment is probably a lower court, but the Sanhedrin would have been equivalent to the Supreme Court at that time. And the third part, if you just say to somebody, you fool, which again is just seems like another insult, but it certainly would have been born in anger, will be subject to the fire of Gehenna. And so I think it's worth going into what is Gehenna, because in most English versions you'll see the word hell. So you'll read Jesus saying, whoever says you fool will be subject to the fire of hell. Holly, what do you think of when you hear you'll be subject to the fire of hell? Like what does that bring up to you? What do you visualize?
Pain, heat, torture, eternal fire.
Yep,
brimstone.
Eternal torture. Right. So he's saying here, or is he saying here, if you call someone a fool, you'll be subject to eternal torture. Is that actually what he's saying? Because that's the common conception. So we're going to start off by saying, well, what is the word hell? And why do I have a picture of, like a valley next to Jerusalem? Well, that's because the word Gehenna is used once in the Greek version of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Septuagint, and it's in Joshua 18:16, and it replaces the more common word Hinnom with Gehenna. Hinnom means lamentation, and every time you hear the word Hinnom in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Scriptures, Hinnom is a valley that is southwest of Jerusalem. So it was the name of the valley before Jerusalem was Jerusalem, back when it was a city called Jebus, which I'm probably not saying right, but that's okay. So, Holly, do you have available to you yes, you do. Excellent. So, Holly, why don't you read 2 Kings 23:10, because that is a good example of what Gehenna was in the Old Testament.
And he, Josiah, defiled Topheth, place of fire, which is in the valley of the children of Hinnom, and no man might make his son or his daughter to pass through the fire to Moloch.
Okay, so in the time of King Josiah, he defiled this place of fire, which was in this valley of the children of Hinnom. So literally it's the valley of the children of lamentation. And what he was defiling was there was some kind of holy place where they would throw their children into a fire for one of the local gods whose name was Moloch. So why don't you read 2 Chronicles 28:3 so we hear again, what is Gehenna?
Moreover, he, Ahaz, burnt incense in the valley of the son of Hinnom and burned his children in the fire after the abominations of the heathen, whom the Lord had cast out before the children of Israel.
Okay, so we had heard earlier that Josiah had stopped the practice of sacrificing children in a fire in this valley. But here we have one of the kings that did do it. So King Ahaz burnt incense in the valley of the son of Hinnom and burnt his own children in that fire. Why don't you read one more, 2 Chronicles 33:6.
And he, Manasseh, caused his children to pass through the fire in the valley of the son of Hinnom. Also he observed times and used enchantments, and used witchcraft, and dealt with a familiar spirit, and with wizards. He wrought much evil in the sight of the Lord, to provoke him to anger.
So King Manasseh was another king of Judah who also, his very own children, he sacrificed them in this valley. And he did other things which were considered objectionable to God and those who followed the Hebrew God of Yahweh. So we have three examples of what happened in this valley, which, loosely speaking, at least in one example, was translated as Gehenna. It also was to become a place that, because so much evil happened there, that it was to become a place of judgment for the people of Israel. And Jeremiah specifically says this 3 different times. Why don't you just do the first one? Jeremiah 7:31-32.
And they have built the high places of Tophet, place of fire, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire, which I commanded them not, neither came it into my heart. Therefore, behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that it shall no more be called Tophet, nor the valley of the son of Hinnom, but the valley of slaughter. For they shall bury in Tophet till there be no place.
So, at the time of Jeremiah, this was at the very end of the kingdom of Judah, and the nation of Babylon, which had been conquering all the neighboring countries, was used as a hammer of judgment. And God basically said, well, what you called the valley of lamentation, where you yourselves killed your children, it's going to become a valley of slaughter. And why is that? Well, I mean, what did the Babylonians do to Jerusalem, Holly?
Slaughtered them.
Yeah, it was real bad. They knocked it down and took away most of the people. It wasn't rebuilt for years. And Jeremiah 19:5-6 says basically the same thing, so we're not going to do that. And why don't you read Jeremiah 32:35-36, because it also specifically says what's going to happen to the people of Israel.
And they, children of Judah, built the high places of Baal, which are in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to cause their sons and their daughters to pass through the fire unto Molech, which I commanded them not, neither came it to my mind, that they should do this abomination, to cause Judah to sin. And now therefore thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel, concerning this city, whereof ye say, it shall be delivered into the hand of the king of Babylon, by the sword, by the famine, and by the pestilence.
Yeah. So he's saying, Babylon's going to bring you're either going to die by the army, you're going to die because you're going to starve to death because they're going to burn all the food while they're there, or you're going to die of illness because of the consequences of having the land destroyed. So all of these uses of Gehenna in the Hebrew prophets and their history, there's 2 main uses of it. Number 1 is it was where pagan practices happened with child sacrifice. Number 2, it was a place of judgment. But was this eternal judgment, Holly?
No.
No. It was a one-time judgment where the people suffered. That being said, words do change over time, right? So maybe even though that was its original use, Jesus still had something else in mind. And so let's look at how he used the word and try to put this together. So how else does he use Gehenna? Read Matthew 10:28.
And do not fear those who kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in Gehenna.
Okay, so Gehenna is a place where both the body and soul can be destroyed. How about Luke 12:4-5?
And I say to you, my friends, do not be afraid of those that kill the body, and after that have no more than that they can do. But I will show you whom you shall fear. Fear him who, after he is killed, has authority to cast into Gehenna. Yes, I say to you, fear him.
Okay, so we don't get any more description of Gehenna here, but it's a parallel description with what we had just heard. Let's hear the combination of Matthew 18:8-9 and Mark 9:43-47.
If your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. It is better for you to enter into life maimed than to go away into Gehenna, having two hands, into the unquenchable fire, where their worm does not die, and the fire is not quenched. Or if your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off and cast them from you. It is better for you to enter into life lame or maimed, rather than to cast into Gehenna, having two hands or 2 feet, into the unquenchable, everlasting fire, where their worm does not die, and the fire is not quenched. And if your eye causes you to stumble, pluck it out and cast it out from you. It is better for you to enter into the life of the kingdom of God with one eye, rather than to cast it into the fire of Gehenna having 2 eyes, where the worm does not die, and the fire is not quenched.
Okay, so here where we learn about Gehenna is that Gehenna itself is an alternative destination compared to life or the kingdom of God, and that Gehenna, the fire of Gehenna, the fire itself is everlasting. It does not stop. Okay, and what we didn't add here is what he says later in the same sermon, where he says virtually the same thing, where he says that it's, if your eye offends you, pluck it out, because it'd be better to enter into life with one eye than to be cast into Gehenna. So that's also said later in the Sermon on the Mount. We just didn't get to it yet. But that is coming. One last place, Matthew 23, where he's ripping into the Torah teachers and Pharisees. So go ahead.
Woe to you, Torah teachers and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you travel sea and dry land to make one proselyte, and when he is made, you make him twice as much a son of Gehenna as yourselves. Serpents, brood of vipers, how can you escape the condemnation of Gehenna?
Okay, so basically he's insulting the Torah teachers and Pharisees. This is right before he was killed. This was one of the leading events leading to him dying. But he basically says to them, unless they change their ways, they're on their road to Gehenna. And there is only one other use of the word Gehenna in the Christian New Testament. So Jesus is the only one using that word, except for his brother James. And James 3:6 does use the word. Go ahead, Holly.
And the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. So is the tongue among our members, that it defileth the whole body, and setteth on fire the course of nature, and it is set on fire of hell.
Okay, so this gives no description of Gehenna. He just says that basically the tongue, and he says, among our members, that it defiles the whole body. And so he's saying that, what gets you into trouble is what you say. And that it itself can be, he's not saying it always is, but he's saying that it itself can be inspired by Gehenna, basically. So it's hard to put that into a context of what Jesus was saying. So if we just look at what Jesus said about Gehenna, he is not saying that it's a specific place right outside of Jerusalem. He's not saying that it is a place where there's sort of temporary judgment. But he does say that it's a place where the condemned are cast into after death. This place has eternal fire, and it is a place where both the soul and the body can be destroyed. Those are the words he used. I don't think I'm adding anything or taking away. What do you say, Holly?
I agree.
All right. That's what it says. So now that quote that Jesus said earlier in Mark, where he said that in Gehenna the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. Well, that is a paraphrase. It comes from Isaiah 66:24. So maybe that tells us something more about Gehenna. So go ahead.
And they all flesh shall go forth and look upon the carcasses of the men that have transgressed against me. For their worm shall not die, neither shall their fire be quenched, and they shall be an abhorring unto all flesh.
Okay, so there is a place where all flesh, meaning living people, shall be able to see the dead bodies of the people who have transgressed against God. Okay? So, and he says that in that place, the fire will not be quenched. So what's the fire? Is that Gehenna? There is, earlier in the chapter, it explains what the fire is. So what's Isaiah 66:15-16 say?
For behold, the Lord will come with fire, and with his chariots, like a whirlwind, to render his anger with fury, and his rebuke with flames of fire. For by fire and by his sword will the Lord plead with all flesh, and the slain of the Lord shall be many.
Okay, so this fire is actually God's literal judgment. So this judgment it's fire and a sword from Yahweh. I know King James always says Lord, but it's the name of God, Yahweh. And a whole bunch of people are going to die. I know it's not a happy time. There is also another important event happening at the time. So we just gave you Isaiah 66:15-16, but at the same time, something else happens. So what's in Isaiah 66:22-23, Holly?
For as the new heavens and the new earth, which I will make, shall remain before me, saith the Lord, so shall your seed, the children of Israel, and your name remain. And it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, shall all flesh come to worship before me, saith the Lord.
Okay, so this is a time, there is a new heaven and new earth. So this destruction is before the new heaven and new earth. So there's big destruction, new heaven and new earth, when all flesh, all people in this new heaven and new earth are going to come to Yahweh to worship. So when we go back to what we had said in the first place, in Isaiah 66:24, when he said all flesh will go forth, this is what he's talking about. So he's saying that first event, fire and sword, big destruction, then new heavens and new earth, and the children of Israel will be in Israel again. All people will be coming there to that place to worship. And when they come, they're going to see the dead bodies of those that were killed, because the fire of the place where the dead bodies are never goes out. So that's, if we're literally going to just take it, that's what it says. That's what it says. So if that fire of judgment is the same as Gehenna, and, you know, with Jesus using that phrase in association with Gehenna, it's pretty reasonable to say that's the same thing. So if that fire of judgment is the same as Gehenna, then it seems to be that what Gehenna was, at least in Isaiah, was it was a place where the fire is burning the corpses of God's enemies after a new heaven and new earth has arrived. So in Revelation 20:9 through 21:8, we see a series of events that are similar to what we've all said. So let's see what that says. Go ahead, Holly.
And they that deceive nations went up on the breadth of the earth, and encompassed the camp of the saints about, and the beloved city. And the fire came down from God out of heaven and devoured them. And the devil that deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are, and shall be tormented day and night forever and ever. And I saw a great white throne, and him that sat on it, from whose face the earth and the heaven fled away, and there was found no place for them. And I saw the dead, small and great, stand before God, and the books were open. And another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged of those things which were written in the books, according to their works. The sea gave up the dead which were in it, and the death and hell delivered up the dead which were in them, and they were judged, every man according to their works. And death and hell were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. And whosoever was not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. And I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. But the fearful and unbelieving and the abominable and the murderers and the whoremongers and the sorcerers and idolaters and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burneth with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. It would seem that Gehenna...
So it seemed that Gehenna is the equivalent of the lake of fire. What happens in that lake of fire? Well, a couple things. Number one, eternal suffering for the devil, the false prophet, and the beast, which is described in Revelation 19:20. It's also the place where a second death occurs for those who are resurrected and not written in the book of life. So if we look at what happened in Isaiah and we compare it to Revelation, you have, in both places, you have a enormous battle happening where God himself rains down fire. Judgment happens on the armies. And in Revelation, it's not just it's not just human armies, it's non-human entities as well. After this time of destruction, then there's a new heaven and new earth, and there's a final judgment. So people who had lived before are now raised from the dead for some kind of judgment. And those who are found, and they're judged by their works, and those who are found guilty are thrown into this lake of fire. It does not say that the people who are judged guilty have eternal torture. What it does say is that the fire is eternal, and that the devil, the beast, the false prophet have eternal torture. And that's what it actually says. Am I adding or subtracting anything, Lily? Holly?
No.
All right. So, in general, what are you taught about hell? Standard Christian response is that, well, when you die, you either go to heaven or you go to hell. Hell is a place where there's fire and you're tortured forever. So that's it, right?
That's correct.
Okay. This is not the story we're seeing here. No, I'm not saying it's radically different, but it's not the same story, is it?
No, it's not.
No. What happens is that people die, and then at the end of time, there is a resurrection. And they're judged. That's what we see. And someone will say, well, yeah, but you're omitting this other stuff. I'll get to the other stuff. I'm just talking about what the word Gehenna is, right? So Gehenna is not the place where people go after they die if they've been bad. Gehenna is a place of fire that is used after the resurrection, after the new heaven and new earth. Right?
Correctamundo.
All righty. So, I like this picture.
Thanks.
Yeah. So, I mean, we've got, if you look at the picture here, this is a Renaissance version of hell. And you've got like somebody from heaven looking down. So
very theatrical.
Yeah, and so where that comes from is Jesus tells us a very specific story about a guy named Lazarus and a rich guy.
Correct.
And we are going to talk about that. And however, Jesus doesn't use the word Gehenna as far as where they're at. That doesn't mean that it's not Gehenna, but we'll get to that. But anyway, we have here people so we got some people from heaven, even though heaven's like a place with no tears and happiness, apparently, it's still, I guess it's pleasant from heaven to watch people get tortured
through a skylight.
Through a skylight of some sort. And we see down there, we see some demonic looking things and some
creatures.
human looking things and
some, like a fish.
Yeah, there's
demon fish.
Yeah, there's stuff down there. And it is scary. I mean, it's amazing imagery. And this kind of
people are naked.
Yeah. Well, except for, the one lady, she's dressed appropriately.
Maybe she's the queen of hell.
Maybe. I don't want to make fun of this too much, but it's just, it's art. We call it artistic license. And it does reflect what people think about it, right?
At least back then.
All right. So, before I get all nutsy, let's go back to the whole point of this story, right? The whole point of this story is that Jesus says, if you're angry with your brother, you're in danger of judgment. He then says, if you insult somebody, you call him empty head, you're in danger of a higher judgment. And then he says, if you call the person a fool, you're subject to the fire of Gehenna. So in Revelation, when they said the people were thrown into the lake of fire, it actually didn't mention people who call somebody fool. That doesn't mean that it's not, part of it. But it's not there. It just says, the fearful, the unbelieving, the abominable, the murderers, the whoremongers, sorcerers, idolaters, liars, shall have their part in the lake, which burneth with fire and brimstone. So, when we ask ourselves a question, was Jesus literally saying that if you call somebody a fool, that this is what you're facing? It's possible. It's possible, but I don't think so. I don't actually think that that's the point of what he's saying here. I think the point of what he's saying here is he starts off by saying, listen, you've been told you're not supposed to murder, but I'm going to tell you you're not even supposed to be angry with someone. Because anger is born in hatred, and hatred is where sin comes from. And, it's even worse than that. So, because a lot of times you're angry with someone for a reason, or maybe it's not a good reason, but it's a reason. But basically, you can't even, it's just as bad, if not worse, to insult somebody, basically. And Jesus himself, we're going to get into this later, he has many bad things to say about the people around him. He insults people. He calls people fools. Is Jesus subject to the fire of Gehenna? Is Jesus burning in hell right now? No. What do you think, Holly?
I don't think he's in hell.
I don't think so either. So I do think it is very fruitful to take what he's saying absolutely seriously. But when we actually look up the word he used, which people commonly translate as hell, it's far more complex than what is presented to you.
Complicated.
And I think you should take what you're being taught with a grain of salt. Now, Jesus is going to continue to talk about the Torah. He is going to be talking about divorce. He's going to be talking about false witness. He's going to be talking about a lot of things. And he's going to tell us what it is. Because, he says a lot of, well, you've heard this, but this is what's really happening. He's going to tell us from his standpoint what it is and what it isn't. And what no one can deny is that the message changed the world. And that it still is. So even the stuff that makes you feel uncomfortable, we're going to take it seriously, but and we're going to look at it. But hopefully you'll stick around and we'll keep going. What do you say, Holly? Are you in?
Yes.
All right, thanks.
Team Jesus.
That awesome.